Briahna Gray, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for being on. It's wonderful to have you on a couple of days before the New Hampshire primary. And I wanted to start off, this past week was probably one of the busiest in American politics because there was so much that happened last week. And it started off with the Iowa Caucus, which was very messy. We didn't really get the results for a couple of days. And, there's been some questioning about, how legitimate some of the findings were. I know that similar to 2016, the 2016 Iowa Caucus, there was an issue again with a lot of coin tosses.
When you're watching, and then flip it over. Flip it over. Heads. Buttigieg. Oh, you want to do Buttigieg.
All right, so Buttigieg will get 3 delegates.
I heard of one instance where there was actually a 3-way tie, so they had to pull somebody's name out of a hat. So it's a very kind of strange situation. I'm just wondering if you and the Sanders campaign have any overall thoughts on the Iowa caucus.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most frustrating aspects of last week is that our campaign worked tirelessly to focus on groups that aren't typically participatory in the process, right? So part of the whole strategy of our campaign is to turn out folks who don't always see themselves reflected in the process and don't always see there to be a real direct incentive to turn out. So we were actually able to turn out students at rates higher than in 2008. We invested heavily in Latino and immigrant communities. And what we saw is that some of the satellite caucuses in particular were caucuses in which Muslims, immigrants, Latinos, East African immigrants were overrepresented. And those were the votes that still have not been properly counted, right? Those satellite caucus votes, right? So you say it took days for us to know the final result. We still don't actually know what the final numbers are. And that kind of ambiguity really makes it difficult to go back to those voters who we convinced to come out and say, hey, the democratic process works and it works for you, to make them understand or make them believe us when we say that it actually matters. So this is a problem that's much bigger than an issue for any one campaign. It's a real crisis that affects how much our citizens think that we have a democratic process that can be trusted. So we are continuing to push for all of the votes that were, all of the caucusers who came out to actually have their preferences counted democratically. But at the same time, we have to focus on New Hampshire and make sure that that's as decisive a victory as possible, so that to the extent that there are inequities in our system that seem to consistently inure to the benefit of one side rather than the other, to your point about the coin tosses, we want to make sure that that's not the case in New Hampshire, and that any uncertainties don't continue to degrade people's confidence in the system.
So again, this was a very busy week. We also had Trump's State of the Union on Tuesday. And during that speech, he really hit the message of the economy a lot. He started off talking about the economy, in fact. And during this State of the Union, and actually during last year's State of the Union, Trump made reference to socialism, saying that this will never be a socialist country. And this actually tied into having Juan Guaido there also, and talking about Venezuela. And I think that if and when Bernie Sanders does win the nomination, this is really going to be the Republican line of attack against Sanders and the Democrats, is fear-mongering against socialism and really using that word, maybe Soviet-era imagery and whatnot.
Bernie Sanders.
Well, I think he's a communist. I mean, look, I think of communism when I think of Bernie. Now, you could say socialist, but didn't he get married in Moscow? And that's wonderful. Moscow's wonderful.
Might have been the honeymoon.
You don't think necessarily, well, whatever, but you don't necessarily think in terms of marriage, Moscow, and it's wonderful. I'm not knocking it, but I think of Bernie sort of as a socialist, but far beyond a socialist.
Elizabeth Warren.
At least he's true to what he believes. That's one thing.
So I'm just curious, what your response to that is, and also to, some of the people who may be considering voting for Trump just because they think the economy is doing good. Again, the unemployment rate is low. The stock market is doing great. Maybe they're even personally making more money now than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So again, how would you push back on this narrative that Bernie Sanders and socialism is going to destroy the American economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes the pat Democratic response to that is to say, no, Trump is wrong. But I think you got to be a little bit more specific than that, because there's a lack of trust in our leadership, and people see the numbers and they just feel like it's a he said, she said situation, and have confidence in Trump. The reality is that, yes, the economy is doing well, but the question to ask is for whom? So 85% of profits that have accumulated over the last 30 years have gone to the top 1% of Americans. Meanwhile, 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, 40% of Americans can't come up with $400 for an emergency. Meanwhile, premiums are in fact sky high. Deductibles are outrageous. Families are paying tens of thousands of dollars every year for health insurance that they can't even use because they can't afford to meet their deductible. And they can't afford to pay for the copays on their prescriptions, right? And all of this is because we have politicians who take money from the pharmaceutical industry, who have to take money from the healthcare industry, and are therefore invested in preserving those profit generating industries over the interests of their citizens, who overwhelmingly support programs like Medicare for All. Remember that upwards of 77% of Democrats support Medicare for All, and even a majority of Republicans at around 51 or 52% support Medicare for All. So with all of those numbers together, it begs the question, why is it, if everyone agrees on what needs to be done to move forward with this country, if everyone understands the specific ways in which Americans are hurting, if there's consensus around a $15 minimum wage and the fact that we need to take fast and declarative action on the climate crisis, why is it that so little is moving in our government? And I think that the reason why some people responded to Donald Trump in 2016 and why a lot of people continue to respond to Bernie Sanders is because they understand there's something fundamentally broken about the way government works, insofar as money has completely polluted the incentives of our politicians. And what they want is someone who is untethered from those the influences of the special interest groups that constantly direct the politicians toward a direction that is opposite to that of what their constituencies are clamoring for. And Bernie Sanders, being the only candidate in this race who has sworn to not take corporate PAC money in both the general election and the primary, someone who has at no point taken billionaire money during his career, didn't suddenly draw a line in the sand because he was running for election in 2020, is someone that is very much trusted by the electorate. And we saw that socialism being thrown around as a critique, not just in 2016, but we saw it thrown around in 2008. Republicans have really, I think, done themselves a disservice by calling everything under the sun socialism. And I think at this point, Americans understand that what's at stake here is really basic social democratic systems that we have here in America, and which are some of the most popular programs that we have in America, for example, Social Security and Medicare, and also the kinds of policies that are modeled by every other similarly situated industrial country in the world, like the Scandinavian examples that Senator Sanders frequently points to. And so the question is, are you going to believe someone like Donald Trump, who ran on fixing Obamacare, who ran saying, I'm not going to let people die in the street, and yet then had no plan to repeal and replace, was going to kick millions of people off of their health insurance if it wasn't stopped by Congress, right? Are you going to trust that person who has already demonstrated that he does not follow through on his campaign promises? Are you going to trust the person who has been fighting tirelessly to expand the rights of Americans, everyday working class and low-income Americans for a 30-year career, and who has a demonstrated record of fighting not for anything radical, but for what Americans want, which is to be able to get their medical issues treated without having to be in a position where you have to choose between food and medicine, or even worse, in a position where you actually pass away, where you lose a loved one, because they simply could not afford medicine in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, a country where we are paying twice as much as other similarly situated countries, twice as much for no benefit whatsoever, for not getting free at point of service care, so that people in the United Kingdom or Denmark or Germany are walking into hospitals, getting treatment and leaving without being presented with a single bill, and being charged and paying half as much, their governments are paying half as much for that health care as we are being charged out the wazoo. And I think that message is actually hitting home with people. And because Bernie is one of the most trusted people in Congress, I think the most trusted senator, the most liked senator in his own state, I think they're going to believe him over the person who 4 years after his campaign has already reneged on all of his promises.
So again, there was a lot that happened last week. You had the Iowa Caucus, the State of the Union, Trump's acquittal in the Senate, and then you also had a debate on Friday night. Something that I was glad came up during that debate was how Senator Sanders showed skepticism to the Bush administration's claims that Iraq had WMD.
Maybe instead of talking about Iraq every single day and having the media talking about Iraq every single day, maybe we should be protecting elderly people who have lost their life savings in a declining stock market. Maybe we should be protecting the millions of American workers who have seen their jobs go to China and Mexico. Maybe we should be talking about the fact that our healthcare system is collapsing and insurance rates are going up. And many of us are sick and tired that the White House is not focusing on the issues that reflect the needs and concerns of tens and tens of millions of Americans. What we all believe is that working together with the United Nations, with the international community, we can resolve this problem without a unilateral American invasion.
Last year, Senator Sanders also showed similar skepticism when there was claims that Iran had attacked a Japanese vessel.
Second of all,
you don't accept what the Secretary, let me just ask, you don't accept the declaration from the Secretary of State?
No, I don't. I mean, there needs to be an objective investigation. As you know, the Japanese in fact, the owner of the tanker that was attacked disagrees with Trump. But here's the main point that I want to make. If you look at the recent history of this country, I think we understand that the two worst foreign policy disasters were based on lies that came from the White House. You remember the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident that led us to increase military involvement in Vietnam. And man, I could speak, that was my generation. 59,000 brave young men never came home from that war, and tens of thousands of more died, committed suicide, got into drugs when they came home. That was based on a lie. And then you look more recently at the war in Iraq, which I vigorously opposed because I did not believe Cheney and I did not believe John Bolton. I did not believe the Bush administration, again, based on a lie that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
And again, I think that was very valuable for him to, lay out that kind of skepticism. So given that kind of record, I'm curious why Senator Sanders hasn't similarly pushed back on elements of the Russia investigation, given that the claims about collusion were found to be unproven by the Mueller investigation, and that former high-ranking intelligence officials like Bill Binney and Ray McGovern have highlighted some problems with the government's claims, and also that some of the elements of the Russia investigation and kind of the Russia hysteria that we've seen, that has been kind of weaponized against independent media and also even against Senator Sanders. And why do you think it is that Senator Sanders hasn't shown that same sort of skepticism that he did about Iraqi WMD with this narrative about Russia interfering in U.S. elections?
So I think that you're right that moment during the debate when Senator Sanders demonstrated his kind of consistent I would say, I don't know, skepticism is one word to say it. Another word is to say thoughtfulness about the implications, the magnitude of what it means to take the kind of declarative action that some in our government on both sides of the aisle are much quicker to take. He has a healthy skepticism of military solutions to problems that can't be solved militarily, and a much more global and broader historical understanding of the root of some of the world's problems. And I think that understanding is reflected in the consideration that he brings to his foreign policy approach. I would push back against you. I don't know that I agree that he hasn't expressed a similar amount of caution with respect to labeling and making broad proclamations about what has gone on with respect to Russian interference. Although there is evidence, that I think at a certain point becomes conspiratorial not to acknowledge to the extent that there is there is some evidence on the ground there, right? And so I understand the concern that, and I think that it's been reflected in Bernie Sanders' comments and actions, that the priority here as we're heading into 2020 is not to belabor some of the controversies and kind of, dare I say, hysteria that was reflected by some of the news media in the intervening years since 2016. And that there is so much politicization of what happened in 2016 and with respect to the election, that the most effective way to move forward, the most persuasive way to move forward, given that controversy, is to focus on issues that are most relevant to everyday working Americans. And truth be told, you know, the amount of energy spent on Russia by the mainstream news and the kind of counterbalancing that comes from some of our left press is not really reflected when you're door knocking and talking to people on the ground about what their interests are in 2020 and what they want to see in this election. So there's a lot of interest in people wanting the election results to be valid, especially after Iowa. You hear people's concerns about the integrity of the process. But more often than not, when you talk to voters about what is motivating them not to come out, why non-voters are non-voters, why certain independents find themselves not reflected by their interest reflected in either party, they are talking about the kinds of working class grassroots issues that are really the keystone of this campaign. And that, I think, is what you might be characterizing as kind of a difference in approach here across these issues. I think there's been really a smart choice made by this campaign that we need to fight this battle on a kind of higher echelon. And that you see it even now in the conversations about some of the pettiness that's been going on with the mudslinging against Sanders these last couple of weeks. As he's moving to front-runner status, a lot of people have decided to shoot their shot, as it were. But keeping the conversation focused on Biden's Social Security record, for instance, keeping it focused on what it means for an oligarch like Michael Bloomberg to be trying to buy this election, spending more money on advertising than every other candidate in this race, and what that means for the state of our democracy. Those are conversations that elevate Bernie Sanders as a front runner, the front runner that he is, and puts him up against the real enemies that he's going to be, the real blockers to his nomination, which it's increasingly seeming like are not going to be a number of other candidates, but people like Michael Bloomberg who are subverting the process, and of course Donald Trump, who is the other billionaire in this race, who is kind of like the upside down version of Donald Trump. And I think that by focusing on those issues, the issues that are front of mind for the average everyday working Americans, whether it's the Black voters in Milwaukee that expressed a great deal of skepticism and frustration about their choices in 2016, whether it's the rural white voters in Iowa, whether it's the rural not so white voters in Iowa, that this campaign turned out at enormously high levels, winning over 50% of the Latino vote in that state. The unifying concern across all of those groups is these kitchen table issues like healthcare, a living wage, housing, national rent control, canceling medical debt, policies like the latter two of which no other candidate in this race is even talking about. And so it can be frustrating sometimes not to have those conversations front and center, not to have reporters asking, why is it that no one else in this race has a plan to cancel medical debt, which only costs about $81 billion, when all of the other Congress people on that stage all the other senators on that stage voted to expand Trump's war budget, which cost similarly about $82 billion, right? Why is it that there is such a lockstep acquiescence to that march toward militarism from someone who everyone on the stage agrees is the most, threatening, the most significant threat, rather, to our republic, but no one in the space of all of this "how can you pay for it" conversation has raised the issue of something like medical debt, which forces 500,000 American families into bankruptcy every year.
So, Briahna, I know we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to get to a few patron questions, if that's all right. Dan wanted to let you know that he thinks you're doing a great job, and he wanted to know what Senator Sanders' position is on Julian Assange.
I'm not sure. That's not something that for the reasons that I kind of went through on my last question. Look, the senator has spoken out frequently about the kind of threats to the press that exist, and the kind of lack of appreciation for the risks involved when whistleblowers bring important information to the fore. And to that end, Bernie Sanders is, I believe, still the only candidate that has put forward a policy that protects the rights of journalists. But I can't speak to that particular issue because that's just not something the campaign has made a statement on at this point.
Janet asks, in order to bolster his appeal to Dem exiters even more, is Bernie Sanders willing to bring up initiatives to empower third parties, for instance, ranked choice voting, inclusion in the general debates, etc.?
Yeah, I personally, as a journalist, written about ranked choice voting quite a bit. And, as we saw in Iowa, some people do feel like there is a level of kind of helpful democracy that can come into the process when people can't bully you by saying, it's this person or bust. It makes people feel a lot more confident in choosing the person they're genuinely happy with without feeling like they have to hedge on their first round vote. Again, Bernie Sanders has put forward a lot of voting reforms that I think are incredibly important, including having a national election day. A national day for everyone to have off of work to go and vote, automatic voter registration, et cetera. And I think internally, ranked choice voting is something that we're discussing and that we've been really gratified to see picked up by states like Maine, who have gone through their first kind of round of voting, I believe, last year.
So last question from John McCarthy. He says, Tulsi Gabbard has called for an emergency summit between Russia, China, and the U.S. in order to address and diffuse dangerous Cold War tensions before it leads to a war. Is this something that Bernie Sanders would support? Does he agree that something like this is necessary?
Bernie has pretty consistently been open to all forms of diplomacy, and is, consistent on the fact that obviously, having dialogues and conversations are preferable to some of the military escalation and direct kind of pivoting to sanctions that we've seen from other candidates, other Republicans especially, who tend to kind of conveniently, depending on what Trump is saying on a given day, be pretty oppositional to the idea of diplomacy, So I think that Bernie Sanders would be open to a lot of different kinds of, consistent with what he said about his foreign policy approach before, be open to many approaches to diplomacy, which would require those kinds of conversations.
Well, Briahna, I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. I know that you must be incredibly busy, so thank you for making the time. For folks out there who would like to follow you and who would like to get involved with the Bernie Sanders campaign, how can they do that?
You should absolutely, if you're not already listening, tune in to the campaign's podcast called Hear the Bern. Hear, HEARBERN, like Bernie. It's a podcast that I host in which we also now make video episodes for every single week, and you can find them on Bernie's YouTube channel. You can listen to the podcast wherever you typically get your podcasts. I also really recommend that you download the Bern app, again, BERN. This is a key tool for relational organizing. The number one way we can turn out voters and make sure that we're engaged is for you to talk to your friends and family, people that you already know, your coworkers, because they believe, people believe folks in their own lives much more readily than they do even a door knocker or someone from the campaign who they don't have an intimate relationship of trust with. So please download the Bern app. Put your contact information for your friends and families in. That's not given over to the campaign. It's simply used for you to reach out and send messages to the people in your orbit, letting them know what their voter registration deadlines are, making sure that they are registered, making sure they know what their voting dates are and when they need to get out, opportunities to volunteer in their neighborhoods, et cetera. And it also is an opportunity to have all of the policies that this campaign supports on your phone. And it's an easy reference point when you're having conversations and really want to be specific about the differences between candidates, which are in fact meaningful. It also pushes through media for you. So, our best videos, the content that we create a lot of content on the campaign, so it's not everything, but the content that we kind of deem to be the most useful for organizing and persuasion, we make available through the app so you can direct it to your friends in a pretty easy way. And I also am on Twitter at Briahna Joy, where I repost all of the content that comes out of our little podcast generating studio here and other notable moments on the campaign. And so I want to say also that I appreciate all of you a great deal. This really is a grassroots movement. We wouldn't be here, we wouldn't exist without the support and enthusiasm from all of our the leftists online like yourself, and the people who have been donating, 1.5 million people who have set records that are unmatched by any campaign. And I feel it during tough weeks like this. I feel the support, I feel the enthusiasm, I feel how deeply invested people are, because these issues that we're fighting for really are existential in a lot of ways. So we are doing really well with your support. I encourage you to keep it up, and I look forward to coming back and celebrating our New Hampshire win, hopefully with you sometime soon.
Absolutely. You're welcome back anytime.
All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Bye-bye.